Hey guys, welcome to the Wednesday afternoon SPASIGMA Personality Quotient broadcast. So I was gone from last week's broadcast. I was off last week. And you might notice that this week, Denzel is not with us. So unfortunately, he's having some technical difficulties today. We are here to discuss the differences between Jungian typology and Myers-Briggs typology, which is a topic that I'm super excited about, because there's a lot of confusion in the personality world about which theories kind of come from where. So today we're going to be talking about where the cognitive functions come from versus where the dichotomous model of type comes from and kind of how those differ. Where this kind of all started is with Carl Jung. So in 1921, we had kind of our first official theory of typology as we know it today. So what Jung came out with back then was this model that included the traits of introversion and extroversion was one. And he also talked about thinking, feeling, intuition, and sensing. But what's interesting is that he didn't talk about type in the four-letter code that we know it as today. So he talked about what we now know as the cognitive functions. So he discussed what extroverted intuition, introverted intuition, extroverted sensing, extroverted thinking, introverted thinking, and introverted and extroverted feeling looked like. But he didn't talk about type in terms of like ENFP or ISTJ, which is a common misconception about Jung's theories. So it was a lot of him kind of analyzing the way that he viewed people, and he had a lot of theories about how he viewed people, which he developed. So he had his archetypes, and he had a lot of speculations that he drew, but he didn't really categorize it in any official way, the way that later on Myers and Briggs did. So he just kind of talked about the similarities he saw between people, and he formulated his own categories for understanding these. He developed what we now know as the functions, either oriented towards perceiving the world in an intuitive or a sensing way and making decisions based on either thinking or feeling. And then he applied his observations about extroverts and introverts to those methods of processing. So that's how he came up with the terms like extroverted intuition or introverted intuition, or extroverted feeling or introverted feeling. He was looking at the way that people perceived the world and the way they made decisions, and then whether they did that through the lens of extroversion or introversion, which were traits that he also coined. Later on, Myers and Briggs came along and they looked at this theory and went, that's pretty cool, but they wanted to add their own spin to it and also make it a little bit easier to categorize. So that's where Myers-Briggs as we know it was born. This was about 20 years later that they started working on this, and they came up with a way to divide things that made it simpler. So instead of saying, okay, you're an extroverted thinking dominant type, which was kind of the way that Jung described it, they went, okay, you're either a thinker or a feeler. And they took away those orientations of the functions from their original theory. So they kind of simplified things, if you will. They watered it down a bit and they went, okay, let's look at just whether you're an extrovert or an introvert. So which of those preferences you're using most of the time. Let's look at whether you're using sensing or intuition most of the time, thinking or feeling most of the time. And then they actually came up with the terms judging and perceiving. So that wasn't one that Jung coined. Jung actually never at all discussed the concepts of judging and perceiving as we know it today. So he did talk about the function attitudes. So judging and perceiving in Jungian terms really just means whether your judging function, which is your T or your F, or your perceiving function, which is your N or your S, are oriented outward or inward. So you can kind of use the Jungian functions to determine whether or not you're a perceiver or a judger, but he didn't come up with those terms. That was part of the theory that Myers and Briggs kind of tacked on in order to make their four-letter type code. That's kind of an interesting and an important point to keep in mind, because judging and perceiving can be a really tricky one for people. It can be tricky for them to figure out which preference they're using. And a lot of the reason behind that is because it wasn't actually part of the original theory that Myers and Briggs was based upon. They invented the terms perceiving and judging, if you will, in order to easily explain to people how they prefer to order their external environment. But being a judger doesn't necessarily mean that you're always organized. Being a perceiver doesn't necessarily mean you're always messy. All it actually talks about is whether you prefer to instill order on the external world or whether you're more focused on order in the internal world. So judgers want to organize their environment, and we call them judgers because, or I assume that they call them judgers because you can see their organization. It's right there. Their environment's organized. The world around them is organized. The way that they approach goals is organized. All the way that they act is in an organized way. Whereas with perceivers, they kind of see the external world as not really their job to categorize or organize, but they're very concerned with maintaining internal order. So they're very much focused on making sure that their worldview is cohesive, that it makes sense, that all the information that they're taking in, they're categorizing in a way that is internally consistent. So they're still actually extremely concerned with order, but that order is about what's happening internally rather than what's happening in their external environment, which they're not as concerned with maintaining order in. So those are terms that Myers and Briggs added on in good faith, but they often get confused. You have this kind of divide in the typology community now, where people will be either very pro-Jungian theory or very pro-Myers-Briggs. So you have certain even websites that take stances on it that say we only use cognitive function theory, which is Jung's original theory, or we only use the MBTI model, and we actually don't want to even acknowledge cognitive functions. And in my opinion, both are really important to understand and to acknowledge. Two people who, let's say, have one letter difference, so in ISTJ and an ISTP. And if you were looking at the Myers-Briggs model, you would think those two types are incredibly similar. And in certain ways they are. But if you're looking at the Jungian model, they actually have completely opposite cognitive functions. So though they may appear similar, they actually process information in 100% different ways, literally as differently as can be. Often you'll have people who have surface level similarities, and those people will tend to have very similar types in the MBTI system, but then they'll have incredibly deep differences in the way that they process information. And you really have to look at the Jungian model for that. The kind of takeaway from this is if you want to get a brief idea of people's behavior, Myers-Briggs will usually give you that. But if you want to get a really deep look at how they're processing information, reaching decisions, which tools are going to work best to communicate with them, you really need to look at the Jungian model because it goes into much more depth. It's much more nuanced, and it kind of fills in all the blanks that Myers-Briggs leaves out. So yeah, if someone's a judger, it means they have either extroverted feeling or extroverted thinking, which is your judging function, your T or your F. And if you're a perceiver, it means you have an introverted judging function. So being a J means that you're imposing that judgment, not in a negative judgmental way, but you're imposing your order, your sense of order in your external environment. Versus if you're a perceiver, you're imposing your form of order on your internal psyche. So you're more concerned with maintaining internal consistency than external, whereas judgers are more concerned with maintaining external consistency, and they don't spend as much time on that internal sense of consistency when it comes to making their judgments. We have a question here. What's the main difference understanding feeling thinking from a Jungian perspective? So the main difference between Myers-Briggs feeling and thinking and Jungian feeling and thinking is that Myers-Briggs groups together people who use introverted thinking and people who use extroverted thinking, as well as people who use introverted feeling and people who use extroverted feeling. With Jung's theories, you have a distinction. There's two types of feelers and there's two types of thinkers. With Myers-Briggs, you only have one type of thinker and one type of feeler, which is overly simplified. Jung saw people as either extroverted or introverted thinkers. So if you're an extroverted thinker, it means that you're very concerned with maintaining logical order in your environment. So you're very goal-oriented, you're process-oriented, not necessarily process-oriented, but you're concerned with how things are being done, how things are being achieved, with meeting objectives, with making sure that you're keeping a strong sense of order in your environment and the way that you structure your life and your thoughts. And you want to make sure that the information that you're taking in and considering and putting back out into the world is very objective, and that it matches up with other people's observations. Whereas with introverted thinking, it's all about maintaining an internal system of order. So introverted thinkers are less concerned with action. Not that they don't take action, but they're less concerned with action than they are with accuracy. So with extroverted thinking, it's kind of like, okay, whatever gets the job done gets the job done. With introverted thinking, it's like, okay, the job needs to get done, but also we should look at all the different possibilities of, how we could get the job done, and is there a better way to do it, and pinpointing the best possible way or the most reliable or accurate possible way. So introverted thinking is very internal, and it's focused on maintaining consistency and accuracy, whereas extroverted thinking is oriented towards the external world, and it's focused on effectiveness. So Myers and Briggs group those two traits together, but actually everyone's only using one or the other most of the time. So introverted and extroverted thinking are very different. And in the same vein, extroverted feeling and introverted feeling are very different. So Myers and Briggs grouped those together, but Jung considered them two different factors. So introverted thinking is about being in touch with your own subjective experience and understanding the world in a cohesive way based on your subjective experiences of it. So introverted thinking is very concerned with authenticity. It's very concerned with understanding the emotional experience of human beings, with understanding people's subjective viewpoints, individually, one by one. Whereas extroverted thinking is all about maintaining harmony in the external environment. So it's all about making sure that people are on the same page, making sure that values are aligned, making sure that people aren't feeling left out or unaccepted. So it's about kind of grouping values together and understanding where there's common ground and maintaining that common ground and maintaining a sense of order and peace in their environment interpersonally. Whereas introverted feeling is about personal peace and harmony and making sure that your own values are aligned with each other. So again, those are two very different modes of processing, but Myers and Briggs make no distinction between them, whereas Jung makes a distinction between them. And with both introverted or extroverted thinking and introverted or extroverted feeling, you'll see strong personality differences between someone who's using the extroverted or introverted form of one of those functions. So they're quite different, despite the fact that they're grouped together by Myers and Briggs. But again, that was just their way of simplifying a theory, which is very complicated. The questionnaire actually combines both kinds of feeling, etc. But Isabel Myers was very aware of the 8 Jungian functions, which she details in her book, Gifts Differing. The simplification was really just for the purpose of the questionnaire rather than a different theory. So that's true. I'm just hiding that because it takes up the whole screen. But yeah, so Myers and Briggs were aware of the functions, and they do speak to them in some of their works. The reason I use the word different theories is because there is kind of a theory to the questionnaire itself. That is different from Jungian theory, especially because it presents these type codes. So with Myers and Briggs, they kind of took these Jungian cognitive functions and they made them into these 4-letter types that gave birth to kind of a new realm of these 16 personalities that each combine with each other in a way that makes that fuses together to make these like powerful personality types. Whereas with Jung, there was no INFP, there was no ESTJ. There's just these function attitudes, and he would talk about how they would relate to one another and how they were expressed in people, but you didn't have these type codes that Myers and Briggs presented, which is kind of where the difference in theory comes from. But Christine's absolutely correct in that Myers and Briggs were aware of the functions, and this is what they originally based their theories on. So this is where they came up with the questionnaire from, is from Jung's theories. So they absolutely did not, and still Myers-Briggs doesn't discount the cognitive functions, which is a very important note. But the main basis of their theory is not centered around the cognitive functions, even though it was built upon it, if that makes sense. Thanks for all the great questions today, guys. This has been awesome. And we'll see you next week.
I'm David Bowder, CEO of SPASIGMA. Every day, each of us is surrounded by a great diversity of people, and indeed, personalities. Some people we find it very easy to relate to. Others, not so much so. Our program exists to help you make sense of your own personality. as well as the diverse personalities around you, to help you improve both your personal and professional lives. Shakespeare said, "To thine own self be true." We'll teach you to understand how to reach the diverse personalities around you, to communicate with them in a way that integrates who you are with who they are. So enough talk about all this. Welcome to SPA Sigma's Personality Quotient PQ program. Enjoy the journey.